Uh, okay. Today we are going to discuss this on our program in English, and I do my best to translate it in Khmer at the end of our discussion. Human Rights Watch has published reports on Cambodia's abusive generals who surround Prime Minister Hun Sen. Just recently, you also updated your report on the so-called Dirty Dozen, the generals who have abused and violated human rights. My first question, Brad, what have the 12 generals done to Cambodia to deserve to be called the Dirty Dozen?
Well, each has a long history of committing very serious human rights abuses to maintain the power of the CPP, and in the last 2 decades, really the singular power of Prime Minister Hun Sen. We have people like Paul Saroun, who used to run the armed forces, who was involved in, for example, the coup in 1997. His forces committed very serious abuses. He was sitting right next to Hun Sen in Hun Sen's compound when the coup took place. He was a former member of the Khmer Rouge, and he's been responsible for many extrajudicial killings. When you're in charge of the army, you're responsible for all of the army's behavior, good and bad. We never saw any effort by Paul Saroun to hold his forces accountable, to end impunity within the armed forces. And as you know, if a soldier does something in Cambodia, they can almost get away with it every time, simply because they wear a uniform. They're protected by senior officials. And there's someone like Net Saboon, who's the national police chief, who was involved in human rights abuses as far back as the 1980s under the state of Cambodia. As you know, he's related by marriage to Hun Sen, and that's why he has his job as national police chief now. Net Saboon was also involved in the coup in 1997, and the police who've worked under him have been involved in things like killings, torture, extortion, and drug trafficking. And then, in another branch of the armed forces, we have General Sao Soka, who has been in charge of the gendarmerie for more than 20 years now. Sao Soka is a very smart guy. I've met him. He looks like a soldier. Problem is that, as he told me, I take my orders from Hun Sen. And so he told me if I have a problem with what he has done, I have to take it up with his boss. Now, a good soldier follows the laws of war, if it's combat, and follows the national laws in peacetime. Yet Sao Soka has decided that his career and his personal wealth are more important than following the law, and so the gendarmerie have been involved in huge numbers of human rights abuses. One of the most famous ones, in addition to his role in the coup in 1997, which he's very proud of, by the way, he admitted his role in the coup in 1997 to me.
I see.
Was putting down protests. There have been a lot of labor protests that the gendarmerie have been called out to put down to stop the labor movement from succeeding in having peaceful demonstrations, peaceful protests, and improving their living and working conditions. I mean, those are just 3 of them. We chose what we thought that were some of the most important people keeping the CPP in power illegally and keeping Hun Sen in power illegally. Because remember, the army, the gendarmerie, and the police they take an oath to the country, not to a political party, not to a particular political leader. And instead of serving the people of Cambodia, they've served the interests of Hun Sen and the CPP.
But all of them, or most of them, also took oath to protect the CPP, the Cambodian People's Party, because many of them are senior members in the central committee of the CPP. So they have, dual allegiance to the party and also to Mr. Hun Sen, not to the country, as you indicated. Okay.
Yes.
With regard to the 12, most of them are army generals, as you indicated, headed once before by Paul Saroun, including General Giamon. The rest are police and gendarmerie generals. Now General Giamon is dead, and replaced by Lieutenant General Po Heng, according to your report, leaving just 11 dirty generals. General Hun Sen was replaced by Lieutenant General Aitmaon. Do you see anyone else who is just as bad as abusive?
Yeah, well, your point about them being senior members of the CPP is very important. I worked in Cambodia. I lived in Cambodia from 1993 to 1998, and I was an advisor to the National Assembly on Human Rights. I'm a lawyer.
Yes.
I gave them legal advice, and then I worked for the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And during that time, I worked very closely with Sar Keng, who was the Minister of Interior, and other people in the government. We drafted a law with the Ministry of Interior that said that senior officials in the armed forces and the judiciary should not be officials of a political party.
Okay.
And if that law had been passed, I think the country would be in much better shape, because if you're a general, you should not be in a political party. Your job is to stay out of politics, whether you're in the police or the army or the gendarmerie. If you're a judge, you should not be in a political party. And the interesting thing was that Sar Keng agreed with this point more than 20 years ago, and the people around him agreed with that point, that senior officials in the armed forces should not be in a political party. So you're right. They now not only are in the CPP, they're very high-ranking people, and they've made it clear that they think their first responsibility is to the party, not to the country.
Okay.
So now, in terms of are there other people who should be on the list? Hing Bun Hing is a very obvious person. He's been sanctioned by the United States for human rights abuses.
Yeah.
We didn't include him on the list because he was actually already been sanctioned and was already pretty famous. There's many other people who could be on the list. It was hard to pick 12 because, unfortunately, there are so many really abusive members of the armed forces. And by the way, the other thing we were looking at, and we published a short video that is on our website that maybe you can show, I don't know if you can, that also talks about how wealthy these people are, because all of them have spent their entire adult lives making an official wage that is not very much as a major, a captain, a lieutenant, ultimately as a colonel and a general. They work their way up through the armed forces. And yet they live in mansions that, if you were a Hollywood star, if you were one of the richest people, in America, you wouldn't have a house this big. I mean, these places are ridiculous. If you look at Kun Kim's house,
yes,
it's the size of a small city. I mean, it's ridiculous. It has a huge mansion. They have swimming pools in their houses. They have a main house, which probably can sleep 100 people.
Okay.
And then they have separate buildings on their property.
Is it in Phnom Penh? Is it in Phnom Penh?
Kun Kim's house is in Kandal.
Kandal province.
Net Savun's house is right next to Olympic Stadium in Phnom Penh.
Yes.
And we show some of these in the video we produced, and we have more footage of their houses that we're going to release soon. But it's absolutely unbelievable how predatory this Dirty Dozen and other generals are. They not only abuse human rights, but they abuse the country's economy.
Yeah.
And if you think about how many extremely poor people there are in Cambodia, it makes it even more sickening that they are living like modern day kings. Yet there are people in Cambodia who don't have enough food to eat.
Yes. Okay. I will follow up on that in a later segment of our discussion. I'd like to touch on what you just mentioned, that you wrote a draft law with Sar Keng, and Sar Keng agreed, the Interior Minister agreed with you, that senior officers in the armed forces, security forces, should not be part of a political party. Has this draft law ever been, discussed, debated in the National Assembly?
No. So what we were told was that when it went to the council of ministers, Hun Sen vetoed it.
I see.
This was, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Sar Keng appeared to be a moderate who was trying to modernize the country, to make it more of a country with the rule of law.
Yeah.
I don't think Sarkang was willing to give up power. I think he would have defended the CPP before he would have defended the rule of law. But he was trying to change the institutional framework. And every time, we worked with him when I was with the UN or others, and there were plenty of others who worked with him. It wasn't just the United Nations.
Yeah.
He proposed something that was more moderate. Hun Sen blocked it. For example, Sarkang was trying to decriminalize speech, and he didn't want there to be criminal penalties in the press law, but Hun Sen wanted there to be criminal penalties. Sarkang resisted for many, many years a law on NGOs, and then now we have Lango, the law regulating NGOs that has very strong provisions. He finally had to give in because Sarkang's position has become much weaker in recent years.
I see. So the two sometimes are at odds with each other on very critical issues, important issues. There are many thousand generals in Cambodia, yet in your report, Human Rights Watch described only 12 to 30 dozen as bad generals. Would you continue to look for more abusive generals? Would you think they will be punished collectively at some point?
Well, our research will continue, of course, because it's important to update this report because the leadership will change. For instance, Kun Kim is no longer a senior military official. He still has a very important role. Yeah. He's senior minister for special missions, whatever that means, but it means Hun Sen sends him wherever he wants. He's first vice chairperson of the National Committee for Disaster Management. He's involved in veterans affairs. But there are other people who are now moving up through the ranks who are more important. And one obvious person is Hun Manet. He's been put in power through nepotism. In other words, only because he's the child of the prime minister. And Hun Sen's clearly trying to create a dynasty of other members of the Hun family. And so we'll have to watch his behavior and what he does. And let's remember, if you are in charge of a unit or an entire branch of the armed forces or all the armed forces, what they do is your responsibility. And under the law, you have a responsibility to know or take steps so that you do know what your troops are doing, and your responsibility to take steps to hold people accountable and prevent further criminal acts or abuses if they come to your attention. So you can't sit on top of the pyramid of the armed forces and say, well, I have nothing to do with what happens beneath me. Right. No, you have responsibility for them.
Yeah. Yeah, as far as the report goes, General Kun Kim is very much involved in the new development projects in Kok Kong province with the Chinese development companies, UDG. That's according to some reports in some major news papers and press. We know that these dirty dozens generals continue to live with impunity. What more can civil society organizations like yours do to hold them accountable and face justice under law?
Well, one thing is we need to watch their career progression. For example, General Bun Sang was promoted to Secretary of State at the Ministry of Defense. When someone has a long record of human rights abuses, they should, in the first case, lose their jobs. They shouldn't be in the armed forces. Yeah. They, of course, should be prosecuted if they committed crimes, but they should not be promoted. So, when Hun Sen promotes these kinds of people, he's basically stepping on the graves of their victims. He's telling victims and their families that he doesn't care at all about what they've done. Another example would be Sok Paul, who was appointed to Secretary of State at the Ministry of Interior.
Sok Paul,
Sok Paul, Sok Paul is notorious. Sok Paul was so notorious during UNTAC that the United Nations was, their policy was they would not meet with him. He was involved in the A teams, the assassination teams during UNTAC that killed so many opposition activists in Fun Sen Pek, the BLDP, and civil society.
I see.
And then he was so notorious that he was not given a job in the first mandate after the UNTAC election. So in the period 1993-1998, he was left out, along with people like Sin Song. He was not given a job because he was so notorious. But
Yeah.
Basically the international community forgot about him. They did. When I was working there, I would talk to people about Paul in embassies and other UN agencies, and they didn't know who he was, which shocked me because Cambodians knew who he was. And so, one thing to answer your question, what can be done, is we can't forget. We can't forget what people have done and who they are, because what they have done in the past is very likely what they're going to do in the future.
Okay.
In terms of holding them accountable, we are still working with the United States, the European Union. The UK has a new Magnitsky sanctions law coming on the books. Yeah. Australia is considering a new Magnitsky law. We're working with countries to strengthen their regime to impose individual personal sanctions on human rights abusers that would involve things like seizing their assets when they're overseas. And many of these generals have so little confidence in Cambodia that they've parked their assets overseas, and they own big houses in lots of different countries. We see people like Netsavun buying property in London. We see pictures of his family, his daughter, taking luxurious trips.
In St. Kitts and Nevis, Central America.
Yes, and then they're getting passports from other countries, like you just mentioned.
Yes,
and we need to make sure that's not happening. There's a big controversy in the European Union now because passports have been given to Cambodians in Cyprus in an irregular process. It appears that there may have been some corruption in Cyprus that led to these passports being issued. But would it be surprising if Netsavun paid a bribe to get a passport in Cyprus, given his long record of corruption? It wouldn't be surprising at all.
Yeah. Now, some years ago, actually a few years ago, our law enforcement, U.S. law enforcement agencies such as the FBI, invited Netsavun to attend some kind of a seminar in the United States. I know that the blacklisting of him and his family members are not part, as long as he has an official invitation to attend something in the United States. But my concern is this: why would we continue to invite someone from a country who has a record of abuses? What can we teach him that he doesn't know? Nothing.
Look, we've had a lot of discussions about this recently with donors and governments. Some of whom have wondered about whether they should continue with technical assistance, in other words, training of police, army, and judges. And the consensus is that this is a waste of time in Cambodia. I spent much of my time in Cambodia doing training of lawyers and judges. Yeah. I did training of police and military as well, as did my colleagues. We had a huge program of training. It's been going on for years and years and years. I think the reality is that they know what their responsibilities are. They know what the law is. They know, for instance, if you're a soldier, what the Geneva Conventions say. They choose not to follow that. That's a choice they're making. Okay. And so you can't train somebody out of their political affiliation or their selfishness, because look, they do these things because they want to keep their jobs, they want to keep their money, they want to keep their power, they want to keep their houses. Right.
Please their boss.
They need to please their boss. And this is not just true in Cambodia. We have this debate in Indonesia, in Burma, Myanmar, in Pakistan, in the Philippines. Training is only useful if there is a political commitment to use that training positively. If we see that the political authorities want the training because they want their soldiers and their police to behave better, and that they will hold them accountable when they don't, then training can be really valuable. Yeah. But clearly this is not the case in Cambodia, unfortunately.
Okay. Now, we talk about army and police generals who have done dirty work for their boss, PM Hun Sen, Prime Minister Hun Sen. Does Human Rights Watch compile records of abuse by other civil servants in high position and include them, at some point in the dirty dozen or 2 dozen?
Yes. I mean, of course we do.
Civil servants besides our forces,
Yeah, they don't have to wear a uniform to commit a human rights abuse. And so, of course we do. I have to tell you, this is a 271-page report. It's now in Khmer as well as in English.
Okay.
It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
Investigating these things in Cambodia is complicated. We are committed to the highest standards of research, so we don't want to make mistakes, which means it takes checking and cross-checking. We believe every single thing in that report is accurate, but it takes a long time. And it's as you as journalists know, that it's dangerous work in Cambodia. It's dangerous for journalists. It's dangerous for human rights workers to go out and ask questions about people who control the armed forces, to ask questions about Hun Sen. It takes a lot of time. And just this last week, we've seen the Radio Free Asia journalists, the two journalists, have the Supreme Court say that they're going to keep the case going. They're going to send it back for reinvestigation. A case where there are no facts showing they've committed any crime. They're still saying they have to go back and start the investigation over. They're basically saying to the court in Phnom Penh, go find some case against them. Go make up some facts, because we are not going to let this case go. Okay. So you can see what kind of fear this can create among journalists. Any journalist in any day, and any human rights investigator, whether you work for Likado or Ad Hoc or anyone else, any day can have the police show up at their house because Hun Sen or some other senior official is angry at them, and they can fabricate a case, they can make up a case, and turn their lives upside down. So the answer to your question is yes, we will continue to do this work, but it takes time.
Okay. All right. Well, applaud your work. It takes a lot of risk in there. I understand that. Now, with these 200 plus page report in English and also 400 plus page report in Khmer, do you think any organization can use this as a proof of facts, to submit it to a court somewhere? Can it be done in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of our goals. One of the reasons we publish facts, we don't just publish opinion, we publish facts.
Right, facts.
Is so they can be used by others for that very purpose. So, Human Rights Watch reports have been used at the International Criminal Court. They've been used at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. They've been used at the tribunal in Rwanda. They've been used in courts in places like Lebanon and Guatemala. I'm very confident that the work in this report will be used by courts in the future. I think the Dirty Dozen and Hun Sen and the people around them have to be really, really careful about when they travel and what could happen, because a lot of countries have what is called universal jurisdiction. Yeah. In other words, they can prosecute people on their territory who have committed crimes in another country. And there's a lot of interest in doing that with Cambodia. I mean, we are hearing from governments around the world that they're extremely interested in our report. Yeah. They contacted us to ask us how they can use it. They've asked us for more information because we couldn't fit all the information we had about each person into the report. Yeah. And they are interested, in taking action on Cambodia. The governments around the world are very fed up with Hun Sen and his regime. Hun Sen has made so many promises over the years about human rights and corruption and protecting the environment and land and all the other things. And he's broken them all.
Yeah. Well, he barely keeps his promise. Okay. You are an attorney by trade. Does it have to be a government to take up the case to court, the International Criminal Court, or can a civil society organization, take up the case?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Civil society anyone can file a claim with the International Criminal Court. And there is a case about land that is being considered by the International Criminal Court that was filed by civil society on behalf of victims of land takings. It basically makes the claim that Hun Sen and the CPP are running a countrywide illegal land taking racket, and that the taking of that land is so widespread, and Global Witness has published a lot on this, is so widespread and has displaced so many people that it amounts to what is called a crime against humanity. And that's something that the International Criminal Court has been looking at for a while. I mean, I do want to caution people, it's not easy to get the International Criminal Court to take up a case submitted. But if people don't submit a case to the International Criminal Court, then the International Criminal Court would not take up many of these cases.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it simply reacts to the front page of the news around the world, but in other cases it requires people to come forward with information.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's hope. Well, by the way, why can't Human Rights Watch take up the case? By itself to the court. I mean, you do the work and you know the fact. Yeah, you can. Okay.
We can. Yeah,
we
can.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, from time to time, we have lots of private communications with the International Criminal Court and other courts around the world. From time to time, it becomes public what we're doing.
I see.
Sometimes it's better to prepare the case and take the time to prepare it properly before announcing anything.
Right.
But the most important thing to us is, we want to hold people accountable, but we also want individual victims to have their claims heard and have them feel like their rights are upheld. So it's not just about accountability; it's two sides of the equation. We need to work with individual victims and victims groups so that they can have their voices heard. Okay. After all, it's their rights. It's not my right that's being violated. It's not Human Rights Watch's right being violated. It's Cambodians' rights.
Okay, thank you. I just have a few more questions. Last year, Reuters news agency reported about Hun Sen's family members using their spouses and cronies' positions to amass wealth and buy foreign real property. Is Human Rights Watch going to include the Khmer rich, they call rich, among the Hun Sen clan members in your next report at some point?
Yeah, we're trying to very carefully assemble this information. Jack Davies is a reporter who used to work in Cambodia who's done some fantastic work also documenting the unexplained wealth of the Cambodian elite. And they publish it, I think, mostly with RFA. I think, the important term here is unexplained wealth. That's the main concept internationally now. If somebody has extreme wealth, they can be asked by courts to show what the source of it is. Yeah. The UK now has a new law. It was used against a Russian tycoon recently for the first time. And this tycoon had to give up millions and millions and millions of dollars in property because he could not explain, I think it was actually a woman, she could not explain where she got it from. Like, how did you, what is the basis for you having all this money to buy all this expensive property in the UK? And that's exactly what we have here. We have people with incredible wealth, both inside and outside Cambodia, who can't explain where it came from. If any of the Dirty Dozen was put under oath in an independent court under the penalty of perjury, I think they would have to say that they got their money through corruption, through bribes and kickbacks and illegal things like land deals or owning interests, hidden interests in garment factories, or other things, rubber plantations. Paul Saroon, I interviewed Paul Saroon years ago, and he admitted to me that he was using I was sitting in his garden in Phnom Penh, and he admitted to me that he was using military helicopters to send people back and forth from Phnom Penh to a shrimp farm he owned in Kampot. And he was using soldiers as laborers in the shrimp farm. And I said to him, is that appropriate? He said, well, he laughed and said, well, the soldiers prefer that to, military duty. I mean, also I give them a little extra money. And then he laughed. For him, this was just routine. This was nothing unusual, nothing even to be ashamed of. He was so used to this kind of corruption that he shared it with someone like me. He's very openly, very, very happily told me about this. Really?
So he is proud of doing what he's done, and proud to tell you that fact too. So
I think he no longer. I think most of these guys no longer see that it's wrong. They're so deeply corrupt. It's such a way of life. They don't even know what they're doing is wrong anymore. They don't understand why people would consider this to be terrible.
Yeah.
I give my boys a few extra dollars, and he left out of the sentence, and I make millions, and I live like a king. He didn't mention that part to me, but that was obvious because I was at his house.
Yeah, I see. Okay, all right. Two more questions actually. Can you see the next U.S. administration, whoever is going to win this election, will pursue the real punishment on the Dirty Dozen and other abusive government officials?
Well, it's interesting that you said that. The Biden campaign has said very clearly that they intend to end Trump's policy of embracing dictators. Right? Joe Biden has said that over and over again, and Hun Sen certainly is a dictator. They've also talked about strengthening the sanctions regimes for human rights abuses.
Yeah.
One of the problems that we were just having a discussion with people in Washington about this week is that the Treasury Department is responsible for implementing sanctions. Basically, the Finance Ministry of the United States is responsible for implementing them. It may be the State Department that recommends them, but it's the Finance Ministry, the Treasury Department, that implements them, and they don't have enough resources and staff because this is a global problem. It's not just Cambodia. I mean, we've seen sanctions in China and Russia and Venezuela. Many other countries have faced sanctions, and so I think the answer to your question is yes. We've been told to expect more sanctions cases of Cambodians, but the process is much slower than we would like and think it should be. I'm very hopeful that we'll see a new administration that actually cares about human rights, because it's clear the Trump administration doesn't, and that administration will put people into positions in the Department of State, Department of Treasury that care about this, and we'll be pressing them from the first day. Trust me, we will be pushing them very hard from day one. Okay.
Yes, we have laws here in place, the Magnitsky Act, Global Magnitsky Act, and also the Frank Dodd, law. What is it? Extraction of natural resources, something like that, and also the GSP as a leverage when it comes to import exports taxes. Okay, one last question, Brad. Just yesterday, Hun Sen warned ex-CNRP, the Cambodian National Rescue Party, MP, Member of Parliament, Ho Wan, to tone down his voice against Hun Sen, against him, or the CNRP MP will endanger his family in Cambodia, his wife, his children. Can this warning represent, a real threat to the lives of Ho Wan's family from a powerful man? And what can be done about it?
Yeah, this is really sickening. Hun Sen does a lot of sickening things, but threatening the families, the wife and children of a political opponent is really almost beyond belief. I mean, this is something, we saw, it's kind of Khmer Rouge behavior or Cultural Revolution behavior. Only the world's worst dictators say and do things like this. It is a threat that they have to take seriously, because Hun Sen has routinely used violence against political opponents. It's beneath the dignity of the office. That's obvious to say, but it needs to be reinforced. A prime minister of a country should have a certain level of dignity. Should behave with a certain level of respect for the office and the people he's supposed to serve. And to threaten people who have nothing to do with the political dispute that he's having is really unthinkable. And I can tell you, a lot of bad things happen in Cambodia. There's a lot of news that comes across the wires about this person or that person being arrested, or somebody being abducted or disappeared or harmed. I got a lot of inquiries yesterday from media and governments about this particular statement Hun Sen made. I think it really upset a lot of people. They really, find this kind of language really shocking. And a lot of people, asking, what can we do about this? What should we do about this? And, the most important thing I think governments can do is to publicly denounce this. They should not stand on the sidelines I told them, I don't want to hear from you privately about how upset you are. I want to hear from you publicly about how upset you are.
Yeah.
You need to communicate this very clearly and publicly to Hun Sen and the Cambodian people. This is completely unacceptable.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you'd like to add, Brad, before we leave?
I think that one of the most important things that's overlooked in Cambodia is that for the last 25 years, the political opposition has engaged in peaceful political activities only. Nobel Peace Prizes have been given out to non-violent protest leaders like Martin Luther King and others. And I'm not suggesting that anyone in Cambodia necessarily gets a Nobel Peace Prize, but my point is that their conduct throughout all this is worthy of serious recognition. On the one side, we have the Dirty Dozen, led by Hun Sen, that have used violence, threats, and intimidation, big and small. We've had coups, we've had killings of activists, so many we couldn't name them all right now. And then we have things like this threat against the family of an opposition member yesterday. And on the other side, we've had nothing but peaceful political protest, peaceful political rallies. And people in Cambodia continue to show incredible courage. I think in some other countries, the political contestation that we've seen throughout this whole period might have ended by now. People might have given up. But I'm very proud of Cambodians. I admire and respect Cambodians who still have the guts and the courage to stay involved in the political process, even though it's very one-sided. And one side has the guns and the power and the money. Yeah. And engage in peaceful protest, when we see the mothers in front of the court protesting, knowing that the police are going to drag them off physically. They still go back day after day. And we see labor, garment workers and other people in labor unions coming out in the streets, facing guns and, riot police and soldiers in helmets, look like Darth Vader out of Star Wars. And yet they go back day after day. I think this is the big missed story, or the unspoken story. I'm sure you've covered it, but it's easy to forget this and just focus on the bad guys. I'd like to focus on the good guys in Cambodia a bit more. And Cambodians deserve a lot of credit for having the courage to keep up the fight. Yeah.
Thank you, Brad. We do from time to time talk about the good guys, and also
I'm sure
yes. Thank you, and thank you for your time, and for sharing your thought, your view on Cambodia with us, and we appreciate it. And
my pleasure.
We'd like you to come back at some point down the road.
Sure, I'm very happy to.
Thank you, Brad. ជំរាបលាបាទសូមជំរាបលាអរគុណចា៎បាទ